Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second Tokyo Global Dialogue. My name is Toshihiro Nakayama. I'm a senior adjunct fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs and also a professor at Keio University in Tokyo. This plenary is about U.S.-China relations. No doubt this is the most important topic that will shape future of world order, which would affect all of us. It has always been important, but I guess now it is important in the context of great power competition. We have five speakers with us. There is a companion website to this event, so you can check the full bio on the companion website, but I'll introduce each speakers very briefly. In an alphabetical order, we have General John R. Allen, president of Brookings Institution. He is a retired U.S. Marine Corps four-star general and former commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force and U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Next, we have Dr. John Hamre, a fellow South Dakotan, in fact. I used to live in South Dakota as a high school exchange student. Is the president and CEO of Center for Strategic and International Studies. Before joining CSIS, he served as the 26th U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense, and prior to holding that post, he was the Undersecretary of Defense from 1993 to 1997. And then we have Professor Jia Jingguo. He's a member of the Standing Committee of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. He is a Vice President of the China-American Studies Association, Vice President of the China Association for International Studies, and Vice President of the China-Japanese Studies Association. And then we have Professor Akio Takahara, who I believe is connecting from Canberra, is it? From Australia. Yes. He's a professor at the University of Tokyo, also a senior adjunct fellow at JIIA. He served as the president of the Japan Association for Asian Study and as the Secretary General of the new Japan-China Friendship 21st Century Committee. He currently serves as director of the JIIA, Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development. Lastly but not least, we have Professor Wu Xinbo, a professor and dean of Institute of International Studies at Fudan University. He teaches and researches China's foreign and security policy, Sino-U.S. relations, and U.S. Asia-Pacific policy. Dr. Wu serves on the Policy Advisory Board of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We were expecting General H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor to Mr. Trump, but unfortunately he won't be joining us. But fortunately, he will be joining us for the closing plenary, which will be held tomorrow. So I hope you can log in and join us there. Just briefly from the organizers, what the aim of this session is. I think there's four set of issues that we may discuss. One reason when we're thinking about U.S.-China relations is I guess it's important to think about the reason for the aggravation of the U.S.-China relations. Some people portray it as a new Cold War, terms such as predatory leadership and a pacing challenge is floating around in the hearing in the Senate in the appointment committees. The slow process of expecting China to become like the United States, I guess, has been abandoned. And in other words, it is the acceptance of the notion that China cannot be shaped in the image of U.S. As a result of this, both sides and the world, for that matter, seems to be getting ready for a long competition, which could deteriorate into a conflictual situation. Then the other set of question is that what are the characteristics of the structural changes of the U.S.-China relations? What have contributed to the deterioration of the U.S.-China relations from the perspective of power competition and also from the standpoint of domestic politics? Has each other's image in both countries changed dramatically in the recent years? It seems hostility has risen to a worrying level. What impact did Trumpian foreign policy have on U.S.-China relations? Was it a pure Trumpian phenomena or manifestation of something more structural? Are there any continuity between the Trump and Biden regarding U.S.-China policy? What are the characteristics of the Xi administration's U.S. policy? What are the grand designs for the international order of the two countries? What are its objectives and goals? I guess these are the big questions. Lastly, for us, it is important to explore what Japan's roles are in this context. In the scheme of things, Japan has clearly taken sides. We are a staunch ally of the United States. Though we would like to maintain a friendly relationship with China on specific issues, that is becoming very difficult. And we see dangers of these tensions penetrating and affecting overall Japan-China relations. So these are the issues, and these issues are in the background. And we may return to these points later in our discussion and in the question and answers. So we shall start by alphabetical order, and you all have 7 minutes to address your points. General Allen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Nakayama-san. It's an honor to be with you all today, this morning, your time, this evening, our time. It's wonderful to see my old friend, John Hamre, again. We've all been sort of hunkered down in the Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. area for a while. It's good to see an old friend, but also to see our friends from China and from Japan as well. I have a few minutes of remarks that I'd like to make, and I want to thank the organizers for convening this very important session. You know, it's no secret that the U.S.-China relationship will be consequential for decades, and in fact, often we say at Brookings that it will be the consequential bilateral relationship of the 21st century. But it's also no secret that the relationship is presently experiencing significant strain. The U.S.-China relations today are arguably facing greater stress than almost at any time since normalization in 1979. Each side has its own narrative for the causes of the downturn in relations. But rather than try in my remarks and this evening to try to adjudicate who's to blame for the downturn in relations, I'd rather like to look forward to where I hope to see the relationship heading. Now, President Biden and President Xi know each other very well, and that I think is a plus to begin this relationship with the new administration in Washington. They each have spent considerable time together. They both are comfortable being candid with each other. They accept the competitive nature of the U.S.-China relationship, and they both also believe it's possible to cooperate while still being competitors. At the same time, neither Joe Biden nor any of his advisors seek to return to the China policy that was characterized by the Obama administration's approach to the relationship. They all recognize that China has changed, and the U.S. has changed, and the world has changed. Furthermore, the Biden team does not subscribe to the confrontational posture that characterized the Trump administration's approach to China. Indeed, neither President Biden nor his advisors have embraced the notion that Pompeo and others promoted of the U.S.-China relations existing in a state of deep ideological struggle for global supremacy. Instead, they have indicated that they will advocate clearly and consistently for values, including human rights and the rule of law. The Biden administration also has jettisoned talk of broad-scale economic decoupling. Rather, there's a focus and a new awareness of the need for our foreign policy to serve the ends of the American working class. So if the Obama administration's approach seemed conciliatory on the one extreme, the Trump administration approach appeared confrontational on the other, then the Biden team's posture on China will likely rest somewhere in between those two poles. President Biden's stance on China policy, reflects an instinct that dates back to the earliest part of his political career, 40 years ago. He consistently sought to position himself at the center of the American political spectrum. He does not hold fixed ideological views on China, or any other issues really for that matter, but he's also by far not a blank slate. He refers to China as the greatest mid to long-term competitor for the United States, but he avoids using terms such as adversary or enemy to characterize China. Instead, the president wants to explore pragmatically whether it's possible to reach an equilibrium in the relationship that allows for competition without catastrophe. And I have to applaud the administration for doing a wide scale or a broad scale review of its entire China policy across the whole of government. Now, to do so, President Biden believes it's necessary for the United States to rebuild leverage for dealing with China. This will require that the United States simultaneously pursue domestic renewal, invest in alliances, reestablish American leadership on the world stage, and restore U.S. authority in advocating for values, including human rights and the rule of law. And given where this administration found itself on the day after its inauguration, while this may seem to be a tall order, it is not an unreasonable aspiration. The president associates such efforts with his ability to compete effectively with China. He views them as foundational sources of American strength. The president believes it is imperative for the United States to renew itself at home at the same time that it reestablishes itself as a leader in the world. These matters must occur simultaneously. They can't occur sequentially. We just don't have the time. So in the coming months, I think you'll be witness to a steady reorientation of America's approach to China. There'll be greater prioritization on shoring up relationships with allies and partners, renewing American leadership and addressing global challenges, healing domestic divisions within the U.S., and rallying international support for ideals that rest at the center of the American experiment. As for China's perspectives of these issues, Professor JIIA and Professor Wu are very well positioned to share their expertise and insights, and we certainly invite them. But it might be worthwhile to me to add two observations on how China's actions and statements are being observed from Washington, however. And I share these observations in a constructive spirit, hoping that they will help contextualize for our audience the moment in which we find ourselves. First, Chinese commentators frequently attribute the deterioration in U.S.-Chinese relations over the last several years exclusively to the Trump administration's desire to contain China's rise. They consider rising tensions to be the result of growing American anxieties. Yet there's no real recognition from our perspective in Beijing of the legitimacy of American concerns regarding unfair Chinese economic and technological practices, and the global community's concerns about China's tightening political controls, or its actions in Hong Kong and in the Xinjiang province, or the threatening behavior vis-a-vis Taiwan. Second, Chinese leadership risks, I think, right now, missing a real opportunity to develop a constructive agenda with the Biden administration, either by, sadly, misreading the United States as monolithically committed to containing China, and it is not, or by failing to grasp opportunities flowing from the Biden administration's priorities and its intent to do a thorough review of the U.S.-China relationship. At least three of President Biden's four top priorities, dealing with the COVID pandemic, economic recovery for the United States, social and racial justice, and climate change, intersect very clearly with a U.S.-China relationship. Indeed, the United States and China, along with many other countries, including Japan, have broadly shared interests around containing the COVID-19 pandemic globally, spurring global economic recovery, and addressing climate change. In this difficult moment for the world, it would be beneficial for leaders to exercise the statesmanship in exploring what can be done to protect lives, to preserve security, and promote greater shared prosperity. So to close, The political transition in the United States provides an opportunity for leaders on both sides of the Pacific to use fresh eyes to evaluate the U.S.-China relationship. And for my part, I believe it is a critical opportunity to reorient the trajectory of that relationship. And I hope the leadership of both sides will seize this opportunity. Thank you very much, Nakayama-san.
Thank you, General Allen. Your point about Biden administration's China policy standing sort of between sort of the conciliatory Obama China policy and the confrontational Trump China policy was very convincing, and thank you for that insight. Now I would like to ask Dr. Hamre for his remarks. Dr. Hamre. I think you're still muted. Yeah, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
You know, this is a problem about getting to be an old guy.
This always happens. I mean, it has to happen at least once in these webinars.
I thought I knew what I was doing, but it's clear I don't. A couple of general comments. First, let me just say congratulations to the Japan Institute of International Affairs for the great recognition they received for their marvelous work as the leading think tank in the world. This is wonderful. So congratulations. Nakayama-san, so good to see you. Now, I say Nakayama-san and I are old friends. I'm old and he's a friend, okay? And I'm so glad to be with him again. We both are from South Dakota, one of the little poor, remote parts of America. But it's just one of the dimensions where we're bound together, and it's really wonderful to be with him again. John Allen, I treasure any opportunity to be on the stage with you anytime. John Allen runs the premier think tank in America, the Brookings Institution, and it's so wonderful to hear his thoughts. And I thought your comments, John, were really very, very thoughtful, and thank you for that. And finally, let me just say, gosh, I miss all my friends in Japan. I haven't had a chance to come to Japan now for over a year because of COVID, and I miss you all greatly because there's so much strength I draw from being around my friends in Japan, the intense culture of civility and decency, and I miss that so much. So I hope I can get my vaccine pretty soon, and I can come over and join you all. So thank you. I'll be very brief. I've got 6 short comments to make, and I'll learn more if I listen than if I talk. I started at CSIS 20 years ago. And in 2000 and 2001, those were days when we were optimistic about our future with China. And I certainly felt that. One of my very good friends, Zhang Bizhen, who kind of coined the phrase peaceful rise. And I was very much hopeful that would be our trajectory. But unfortunately, things have shifted, and we now have a new attitude in the United States. And I'm sorry about this, but the new attitude is one where we have a very different view about China. We certainly recognize the energy, the dynamism, the creativity of China, but most Americans now look at China as a threat, and that's something we're going to have to work through. It's something that I'm concerned about. Number 2, there are really 2 camps in Washington. I use Washington metaphorically to talk about the political leadership in America. There are 2 camps in America. I think there are those that see China as a military threat. That's in one camp. And the other camp is those that primarily see China as an economic and technological challenger. and there's some overlap between them, but this is now a fairly uniform bipartisan view that we are in a great competition with China. Now, I will say I'm personally in the camp that the competition is about economics and technology advancement. And China has accomplished really remarkable things. And America now needs to get it into condition. It's a little like being an overweight, runner that hasn't really done much running lately, and we got to get back in shape, And I think that's where we are, and I think that it's those two camps. But I think the second camp is going to prevail on how we approach things over the next couple of years. The third point I would make, and I would like to draw, I'm going to use a metaphorical distinction between New York and Washington. And I use the metaphor New York to refer to the business community. And I use Washington as a metaphor to refer to the policy, national security, foreign policy community. New York, the business community still sees the enormous power and potential of the Chinese economy and wants to find ways to participate in that. Whereas Washington really is increasingly seeing China as a threat and a competitor, and a dangerous competitor. And these two voices, the New York voice, the Washington voice, they were present inside the Trump administration, and they're also very much present inside the Biden administration. I think what it means is that you'll hear vocal expressions that are pretty negative, but you'll hear private expressions that want to find solutions. And I think that is the dynamic that's still going to play through the Biden administration. You will hear negative things. That's certainly true. But I also think that, in private counsel, there's much more of a hope that we can find a working relationship. The fourth point that I would like to make is that, and here I'm worried, because it seems to me the growing tension between China and the United States almost inevitably is going to result in a bifurcation of the international order into two competing international systems. I don't think that's going to be good for either of us. But I do think that is the trajectory that we're on at this stage. And it's probably something, Nakayama-san, we should come back to in the question period, to look at this. Is this what we want? Is this something that we can avoid? But I do think we're heading in that direction, and I think it's quite serious. Number 5, I would say, and this is about the United States. As I mentioned, we have these two camps. The one camp that believes this is primarily an economic and technology competition. This camp has considerable momentum, and I think you will see on a bipartisan basis in the United States very significant steps to improve America's innovation culture going forward. I think that's going to be a very prominent dimension of American domestic policy. We're divided on lots of issues here, very divided on lots of issues. But on this issue, we're not divided. And I think that there's considerable effort to boost our capacity to compete against China, because I think we recognize what a formidable competitor China has been. My final point, and I'll be brief, and I apologize, I've gone too long, but my final point is that I'm always optimistic. I'm hopeful. I want to find solutions. John Allen spoke to that in his comments. Let me say that I do think we have in front of us a roadmap where we could start building collaboratively to avoid a crisis. And I believe that roadmap was delineated at the Osaka G20 summit. Now, this was 2 years ago. Japan was the host of the summit. I thought that Japan did a spectacular job, at the Osaka G20 summit. They outlined things, and all 20 participants endorsed the communique on the way forward, that we could work together. And I hope that that becomes a roadmap that we could use. Japan, China, the United States, we could all use to try to avoid this worrisome prospect of a bifurcation of the international order. I think that it would be worthwhile for us to explore that together. Okay, thank you so much, Nakayama-san. I apologize, I've gone on too long.
Thank you, Dr. Hamre. Your point about, though we call this competition a great power competition, the future is not set and there are still many uncertainties. I think that point was well taken. And also that you reminded us that we tend to fall in the trap that there is only one single U.S.-China policy, but actually there may be few. You mentioned about the New York wing and the D.C. wing, and there may be some Nebraska wing, maybe. So, we have to sort of understand sort of the multi-faceted nature of a U.S.-China policy, and your point was well taken. Thank you, Dr. Hamre. So next, I'd like to ask Professor Ji for your remarks, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Japan Institute for International Affairs for the invitation. And also, it's a great honor and privilege to follow the two distinguished American speakers, great friends I met over the years. I share a lot of views, what they just expressed. For example, the problem we had in the relationship. It's not just Trump's problem. It's a lot of people's problem. And also, we should try to avoid international bifurcation as much as possible. Basically, I want to say that the current state of China-U.S. relationship is maybe strategic competition. That's the term that everybody accepted now. It came out in 2017 when the Trump administration came up with this label. But of course, if you trace it earlier, the Bush administration also said that. But then it was it never repeated afterwards, but with the Trump administration, it became a standard term to describe China-U.S. relations. And for various reasons, the Democrats appear to have accepted this label too. So many believe that strategic competition will continue to define the relationship under the Biden administration. I think probably that's the case. But what exactly did strategic competition mean for China-U.S. relations during the Trump administration? And will it be different under the Biden administration? And if so, in what ways? So this is the questions that I want to address. The strategic competition between China and the U.S. under the Trump administration, upon hindsight, is rather malign. First, it was a competition to undermine rather than outperform the other. Okay. The Trump administration managed to trash the engagement policy that previous American administrations had adhered to, whether Republican or Democrat, since the normalization of the China-US relationship in 1979. Okay. And it devoted much time and energy to smear China and accuse Beijing of trying to destroy freedom and democracy and dominate the world through territorial expansion and diplomatic coercion. To this end, the Trump administration pressured, collaborated, and with in some cases, other countries to work with the US to contain China. Many Chinese, both in and outside the government, believe that China should not tolerate this. They argue that what the United States wants from China is not just its money, but also its life. That leaves China no alternative but to fight for its existence. Thus, China pushed back on a whole range of issues, including human rights, Hong Kong, and South China Sea, and Taiwan, and trade. Secondly, under the Trump administration, China-US strategic competition was a competition where the end justifies the means. To rally domestic and international support to contain China, the Trump administration resorted to spreading lies and misinformation. It branded the COVID-19 virus the China virus. It claimed that China's Belt and Road Initiative is a death trap, and China's economic growth has been a result of theft of American technologies and unfair economic policies, rather than China's efforts, successful efforts through diligence and industry. Infuriated by the Trump administration attacks, some Chinese retaliated in kind, presenting the US as a vicious monster constantly stoking conflicts and wars overseas to advocate its selfish interests in the name of defending freedom and democracy. One Chinese senior diplomat even alleged that a US military lab was responsible for the COVID-19 outbreak. This trading of barbs deepened the mistrust and hostility between the two countries. Finally, it was a lose-and-lose competition. The trade war initiated by the Trump administration has left many factories closed and many people unemployed in both countries. American consumers are paying more for imported goods. The technological war saw high-tech companies from both countries bleeding. The two countries found it difficult to cooperate on anything, even on the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Both countries imposed sanctions on each other's companies and officials, closed down each other's consulates, traded insults and attacks, and suspended most official channels of communication. The two countries' warships and military aircrafts tried to outmaneuver each other in close proximity in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, escalating the risk of an accidental military clash. It's this kind of strategic competition in which the Biden administration wants to engage. On the surface, it appears so. For example, senior officials recently stated in the congressional hearings that they believe that the Trump administration was correct to take a tough approach toward China. They also openly claim that the administration will work with US allies to put pressure on China. But closer analysis suggests that despite the tough rhetoric, the Biden administration's understanding of the strategic competition could be very different from that of the Trump administration. First, the Biden administration appears to favor a competition to outperform rather than to undermine each other. At home, it promises to focus on issues like restoring unity, freedom and democracy, investing more in education and science and technology, and reversing the trend of economic polarization that has frustrated and angered many Americans. Overseas, the Biden administration claims that it will try to restore relations with US allies and rally international support to tackle global challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic, economic recovery, and growth and climate change. While accepting some aspects of US-China relations are increasingly adversarial, the new administration in Washington also argued that the two countries share important interests in other aspects, providing opportunities for cooperation. The Biden administration appears to resist the idea that the end justifies the means. It has condemned Trump's practice of spreading lies and misinformation and claims that it will develop policies based on principle and facts. Senior Biden officials indicated that they will reassess some of Trump's China policies as well. For example, Jen Psaki, White House press secretary, said on January 29th that everything the past administration has put in place is under review. Crucially, the Biden administration does not believe that an all-out confrontation with China serves the US interests. During the presidential election campaign, Biden risked losing popular support by declaring that he perceives China as a strategic competitor rather than an enemy. While endorsing a tough approach toward China, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken also said the Biden administration's policy, China policy, will be different from his predecessors. The new administration will confront China on some issues while seeking to collaborate with China in others where the two countries share interests. This leaves much room for cooperation, given that the two countries actually share many things in common, many interests in common. So although the Biden administration's approach to strategic competition is quite different from Trump administration's approach, it does not necessarily follow that China-US relationship will stabilize and improve. How the Biden administration actually deals with the thorny issues between the two countries is yet to be seen. It will also depend on how China responds to US actions. Given the strong negative public sentiments toward each other at home, and their increasing divergent domestic political practices, a truly benign strategic competition still remains a difficult, if not impossible, mission to accomplish. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Jia, for your insights. You seem to be cautiously optimistic about the prospects of Biden administration's China policy, in that it would seek a sort of a responsible competition rather than a punch-you-in-the-face toughness of the Trump administration. We can come back to that point later because it's an important topic. So now I would like to ask Professor Takahara for your remarks. Professor Takahara, please.
Well, thank you very much, Toshi. In fact, I'm in Perth now, not in Canberra. I'll be flying back to Canberra after this seminar. It's midsummer here. So yesterday, I had to go to the Indian Ocean and have a swim. Fortunately, the Indian Ocean yesterday was very, very peaceful. Now, it's such an honor and pleasure to be sharing this panel with wonderful colleagues from both the US and China. And as the only participant from Japan, I suppose my task is to provide a Japanese perspective on this important issue. Now, from my perspective, when the world order is in flux, I think it is useful to go back and reflect on where we began building it. And for many countries, the starting points would be the days in the wake of World War II. And such countries, of course, include Japan. And if we revisited the 1947 Japanese Constitution, which of course is the foundation of our nation today, we find the following sentences in its foreword. I find these sentences very fascinating. I quote, "We recognize that all peoples of the world have the right to live in peace, free from fear and want." To live in peace, free from fear and want? That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Here you find that our Constitution actually preempted the core idea of human security. Then it goes on to state the following, I quote again, "We believe that no nation is responsible to itself alone, but that laws of political morality are universal, and that obedience to such laws is incumbent upon all nations who would sustain their own sovereignty and justify their sovereign relationship with other nations. No nation is responsible to itself alone, but that laws of political morality are universal, and that obedience to such laws is incumbent upon all nations." Now, I must say that on the one hand, we are all relieved that the top leader of the sole superpower is no longer crying America first. And we also hope at the same time that the leaders of the sole superpower candidate will not base its external actions on exclusive nationalism, but abide by the laws of political morality and make use of its might for the sake of the broader part of humanity in ways that are broadly acceptable. Japan has been called a country that is advanced in meeting new challenges. The new challenges have included pollution, environmental degradation, energy crisis, financial crisis, the bursting of the economic bubble, aging population, and so on and so forth. I think we can say that coping with a rising China is one of those challenges that the Japanese have had to face earlier than many other countries in the world. And that is a pity, since we in Japan think we help China very sincerely in its efforts to develop and modernize. But now there is no choice for us but to respond to China's maritime advancement and its attempts to change the status quo by physical force. So while increasing our budget for the self-defense forces and for the Coast Guards, we are pressed to think that we need to reinforce our alliance and our alliance network. But at the same time, we all understand that globalization is at work, even today, and economic interdependence with China is deepening every day, even now. So we are most happy with the conclusion of RCEP negotiations, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiations, and we welcome China's willingness to join the CPTPP, the TPP, and hope that the US will come back to TPP. Thus, Japan has learned, perhaps earlier than a lot of other countries, the hard reality that we must compete and cooperate with China at the same time. And we have been implementing this two-pronged approach towards China for many years now. In fact, I believe by now, the Chinese side has also realized that they cannot avoid competing and cooperating simultaneously. I hear these words from my Chinese colleagues much more than before, that we have to compete and cooperate with countries like the United States more than before. So now I understand we are all in the same boat. So the two-pronged approach, in my humble opinion, is perhaps the only way forward. But this is not an easy path, is it, for anybody, since it is inherently contradictory. Compete on the one side and cooperate on the other, right? And therefore, I insist that we all must have the resilience and wisdom to live with and live through this contradiction without going into a conflict. Can we do that? We have to do that. But to maintain the right balance will become increasingly difficult, since it is likely, as our colleagues have already hinted, that competition will intensify on the one hand, and cooperation will deepen at the same time. And this means that our nations will be divided internally. We will be divided inside our countries, and we shall have to be ready to use a lot of time and energy on internal coordination and persuasion. So what is of utmost importance is that all of us stay cool and resolutely avoid the use of force. As my initial remarks, I'd like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Takahara. Your point about the fact that we have to accept the contradictions and we have to pay attention to the sort of the cooperative side and sort of the competitive side was very insightful. But I guess all of us worry that as a result of this contradiction and as the sort of the competition side intensifies, this mood of doubt, not just between US and China, but between Japan and China as well. This increase of doubt is very worrisome. But your point about that we have to accept the contradictions was a very heavy message, and I thank you for that. So now we would like to turn to Professor Wu for his remarks. Professor Wu, the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you. Good morning from Shanghai. First, I want to thank JIIA for inviting me to attend this very high-profile forum. And I have learned a lot from the previous panelists. Now, let me talk about three questions raised by the organizers. What are the reasons for the aggravation of Sino-US ties? What are the characteristics of the structural changes in US-China relations? And finally, what are the prospects of this relationship? First, when we talk about the reasons for the worsening of bilateral ties over the last several years, the US side tends to attribute it to the challenges posed by an increasingly capable and confident and sometimes assertive China to US primacy and the international order, whereas China attributes it to the lack of willingness and ability on the part of the US to accommodate a rising power and adapt to the changing international political and economic landscape. In my opinion, there exist two false assumptions behind the US policy towards China. One is US primacy in the world and the need to preserve it. The other is the superiority of US or Western governance model. Being immersed in such illusions, US policy elite fails to adjust to the shifting power balance worldwide and to recognize the weakness of US or Western governance model. This makes it impossible for Washington to deal with China on a realistic basis. Now, second, what are the structural changes occurring in this relationship? I think there are many. Let me just mention a few of them. First and foremost, of course, is the rapid narrowing of the capability gap between China and the United States, not only in economic power, but also in governance capacity. If we compare the way China and the US handled COVID-19 challenges, people can draw conclusions about their respective governance capacity. The second change is that in the United States, there is a domestic consensus that China is America's primary challenger, and therefore it needs to get tough on China. These days, when we talk about US domestic politics, we talk about polarization, However, both parties now have a consensus on China. China is America's primary competitor or even adversary. I think the anxiety over the rise of China, as well as the frustration that China didn't live up to the US expectation, have worked to inflate the US concern over China. The concern is real, even though it may not be well-founded. In China, there is also a strong belief that the US is endeavoring to contain and disrupt a rising China, and therefore China needs to formally stand up to it. I still recall in the early Trump administration, when it started the trade war against China, in China there was a school of thought that this should be an opportunity to push China further open up and reform. But gradually, people realized that the intention behind Trump's approach to China was not that simple. As Trump told President Carter in their phone conversation, he wouldn't allow China to surpass the US. So that's the only reason that's why the US has changed its attitude toward China in a fundamental way. The third change is that since the Trump administration, Washington has been promoting decoupling with China in economic, technology, and other areas, while Beijing has just come up with the so-called dual circulation development strategy, which places emphasis on domestic market and domestic development. So both China and US are trying to reduce economic interdependence with each other, reversing a trend that has prevailed in the previous 40 years. In the previous 40 years, both China and the United States had worked to strengthen economic interdependence with each other. Now they are falling apart. The next major change is that the US, since the Trump administration at least, is trying to restructure a JIIA strategic framework aimed at China, from Quad in the Indo-Pacific to the so-called D10 coalition in the global level. While China has been pursuing various economic initiatives, such as Belt and Road Project, RCEP, that enhance China's economic interests. So these two countries are trying to develop different geopolitical and geoeconomic designs, which actually are trying to exclude the other side. So what are the prospects of Sino-US relations? Theoretically, there exist three scenarios. Scenario one, both competition and cooperation, which was familiar to us before the Trump administration. The second scenario is dominance of competition with cooperation as a supplement. The third scenario is competition and conflict, which was very much the case with the Trump administration in his later period. What can we do? China has advocated for a relationship of no conflict, no confrontation. China does not deny competition, but we really want to avoid conflict and confrontation. While the Biden administration also suggests that competition with China does not necessarily mean conflict. In his recent remarks delivered at the Munich Security Conference, President Biden said, "We cannot and must not return to the reflexive opposition and the rigid blocks of the Cold War," which is a very constructive comment from the Chinese perspective. So I think there seems to exist a convergence between two sides over scenario two. That is, competition first, but cooperation is also a very important part of this relationship. Now, how can we get there? The most important thing is that we should keep competition manageable while keep cooperation indispensable. How to make competition manageable? First, the purpose of competition is to lift oneself rather than to weaken the other side. I think the Trump administration in its competition with China had devoted most of the resources to weakening and defeating China rather than lifting the US itself. While the Biden administration now has determined that the US has to work for its own revival to lift US capability as a leverage in the competition with China, which I think is the right way for competition. And also for the competition to be manageable, both sides should not cross the red line. Even during the Cold War between US and China, US and the Soviet Union, each side understood the red line in their competition and confrontation. So I think China and the US should engage in intense dialogue about what are the real red lines in their relations and how to make sure each side will not cross it. Now, for cooperation, which I think should be an important, indispensable part of this relationship, we should work on two sides. One is that we need to protect a viable environment for human beings. In that case, we should work together to deal with climate change, for ecological environment protection, and also to deal with pandemic such as COVID-19. The lack of cooperation between China and the United States in COVID-19 has already taught us a big lesson. The next important thing in cooperation is that we need to preserve an international system in which both countries have huge stakes. I cannot agree with Dr. Hamre more when he said he was concerned about the trend of bifurcation in the current international system. I think both China and the United States have benefited a lot from the current international system. It is not perfect, but we should keep it while reforming it. So China and US have a lot of areas to work with each other in United Nations, WTO, G20, and other forums to promote the improvement and maintenance of the current international system. So the major difference between China-US competition and the US-Soviet Union competition is not only in their level of economic dependence, but more importantly is that between US and the Soviet Union, they were in different international systems. But now between China and US, we are still very much in the same international system. So that is the paramount thing when we think about bilateral relations. Let's not just talk about bilateral issues when we think about this relationship. We really need to put international system as the number one priority. And also it's important, we should not just have the dialogue between our two countries. We should talk to the Europeans, talk to the Japanese, Canadians about their concern over China-US relations to get their advice about how we should manage our relations when competition is becoming more and more intense. I will stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Wu. Your remarks made us aware of the importance of understanding and how U.S. and China sees each other. And your point about this possible three scenarios, and somehow we should aim at sort of the second scenario where the competition would be dominant, but the sort of the cooperative side would somehow play in and avoid that relation sort of deteriorating into this conflict and confrontation zone. I think that was a very important point. I thank all the speakers for abiding by the time. And this is a message to the audience. We would engage in a dialogue among the panelists for 20, 30 minutes. But after that, we would like to gather some questions. And you can post your questions using the question function, or you call it a chat function, a Q&A function. I think there's a some button on the screen. So you can push that, click that, and then you can post your questions in either Japanese or in English. Okay, and we will try to sort of answer your questions after we engage in the discussions. So I'm not going to summarize the points that the panelists made because they were really clear, concise, and clear, and I don't think I need to do that. And I'm going to sort of throw out some points. Many of the points were already addressed in the remarks, but because the time was limited, each speaker did not have a sort of chance to sort of elaborate on that point. And I guess what is sort of concerns us, and one of the most the biggest interest that we have, is what is the difference of Biden team's China policy and the Trump team's China policy? And because General H.R. McMaster is here, no one's here to actually defend the Trumpian China policy. And I'll try to do that. Not that I am a defender of a Trumpian China policy. Here in Japan, there were this understanding that the Trumpian China policy is not as bad as it seems. It may be rough, it may be too straightforward, but it was unambiguously tough. And it sent a clear message to China and to the world that U.S. realizes the strategic competition going on. And this would be a long game, a long competition. And here in Japan, when the Obama team took off in 2009 in January, it seemed like to us that the Obama team was seeking for a G2 version of U.S.-China relations. Maybe that's an oversimplification, but that's how many understood. But Biden team is not taking that route. Many has happened between 2009 and 2020. Was there any trigger event that shifted U.S. understanding of China? And what is the difference between the Biden China policy and the Trump China policy? And sort of, the same topic, but a different side of the same coin. But what is the continuation of the Biden China policy and the Trump China policy? And I'd like to sort of ask General Allen and Dr. Hamre to address these points. And what are the sort of China's perception about these topics? And I'd like to ask Professor Takahara as well about how Japan perceives these differences. So who's ever willing to take the floor about these points?
I nominate John Allen to take the floor.
General Allen, could you give us some insights?
Thank you, Nakayama-san. I guess it depends on how quickly you can get to your mute or unmute button to determine who goes first. And I noted that we did leave out South Dakota as one of the centers of policy formulation.
That's true.
We said New York City, Washington, but we left South Dakota out. So I'm I don't think we really know yet the full contours of the Biden approach to China. I'll say several things. First, President Biden is intent on creating a relevance between his actions to repair the really significant domestic issues that we have in the United States to the foreign policy that the U.S. will pursue. You'll hear the term a foreign policy for the middle class. And I think John Hamre mentioned this, and that was that there is a sense of disenfranchisement by much of the American population, either through demographic change or the advent of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and a failure of globalization in many respects that created enormous economic challenges for the American people. And in many respects, the Trump campaign in 15 and 16, and then the Trump administration pursuing what I would call, with America first being the sort of the mantra, pursuing a populist unilateralism, made it clear to much of the voter base in the US that many of its woes could be traced directly back to China. And so I think that while, as I said, the problems that the US-China relationship experiences today didn't emerge solely in the Trump administration, in many respects they were, those flames were fanned in a very real sense. That plus the inflammatory rhetoric made it very difficult when the President of the United States talks about how China is, and I ask the indulgence of my friends from China, when he would say that the Chinese are raping the American economy. I used to say to my American friends, China really understands the issue of having its nation raped. So we all need to be very, very clear about the language we use, and the bombastic language of the Trump administration, an administration filled with ideologues with regard to holding strong anti-Chinese feelings and making that a central policy and the reason, in many respects, for the downturn in American economic capacity for the middle class. I think that really did two things. It did in fact make China take on the appearance of the principal adversary or enemy of the United States, but it also in many respects polarized our politics. And where before there was not the strong bilateral feelings against China or about China that we see today, I think much of that became a polarization going forward. Now, to be very clear and to be very fair, there were very serious economic issues that the United States and China needed to resolve. But to take those on in the Trump administration with a trade war, and I can remember very clearly the president standing, I think, in the Rose Garden saying that trade wars are easy. Well, turns out the trade war wasn't easy. And it ended up costing American farmers billions and billions of dollars of overseas trade with China, and enormous loss of job productivity in the United States, as it did in China. So the trade war turned out not to be easy. And as a result of all of that, we only got one phase of a trade agreement. And China isn't even adhering to that. So what was it all for? So we have a real issue associated with both the language, the ideology, and failed capacity to return on the promises to hold China accountable by the last administration. Now, the Biden administration, I think, informed by a long career in the Senate, having watched China evolve over the 40 plus years of our relationship, having seen certain levels of success with the Obama administration, I think the Biden administration is properly re-examining every aspect of the U.S.-China relationship. And I believe very strongly, as Dr. Hamre said, that there is no desire by the U.S., A, to contain China, or B, to permit the circumstances to go forward where the U.S. and China create a bifurcation, an economic bifurcation, a technological bifurcation, or a military polarization in the region. And I think my Chinese friends need to understand when President Biden talks to our dearest allies in the world, Japan being one of the closest that we have, and other allies and friends and partners, they need to understand that that's not an intention necessarily to create a multilateral containment of China. Remember that American foreign policy has always been characterized by a multilateralism that was not present in the Trump administration. They were going it alone. Very little consultation with Japan or Korea or our friends in Europe with regard to China. We were going it alone. And so there shouldn't be an inherent fear that the United States having a D10 or a conversation of democracies about the future in the context of creating greater competitiveness doesn't inherently create an outcome of containment. And I'll simply say, and I really commend our fellow speakers for I thought their wise comments tonight, and Dr. Takahara-san was very, very eloquent on this point. We talked, where I come from, about the 4 C's. The first of those C's is with China, seek areas of cooperation. The second is there will be inherently between our two countries competitiveness. The second C, compete. But there should be opportunity from competition, and seek where you can to find opportunity from competition. The third C is confrontation, and we have to manage. This is where statesmanship comes in. This is where diplomacy comes in. This is where cool-headed economic conversations come in, trade conversations. We have to manage competition so it doesn't become confrontation. And sadly, we were on the confrontation end of competition for most of the last 4 years. And look, I've been in the service for over 40 years. I know that the distance from confrontation, particularly with hotspots in East Asia and the South China Sea, with Taiwan, with other areas that the Korean Peninsula, which could flare very quickly, the road from confrontation to conflict is very short. And once blood is drawn, it's so hard to walk back from that. So all of us, not just US and China, but all of us needs to find a way that as we compete to manage that competition that reduces confrontation. I, like Dr. Takahara-san, I absolutely believe that we have the capacity and the wisdom and the skill present in the Biden administration to find a way of doing both. And with regard to cooperation, there are enormous opportunities for the United States and China, and more broadly, the global community to cooperate. Brookings led a delegation, a U.S. delegation, in bilateral talks with the Chinese delegation recently on how we should go about the business of globally dealing with the pandemic. Not looking backwards, not assigning blame. How can the United States and China exert leadership to deal with the pandemic going forward? And I have this image still of the American delegation on the Zoom screen as the Chinese delegation came on the screen as well. Delegations on both sides, mostly scientists and doctors. The warmth and the genuine affection that each side had for each other, because they'd been working together for years, was so uplifting to me. That was just one example of where China and the United States can find common ground to move forward, if the politicians have the will to do this. Beyond the pandemic, not this one alone, but the next pandemic, because another one is coming someday. Climate, we are not going to solve climate unless we work together, the United States and China. Nuclear non-proliferation. That's not going too well in some places. This is another opportunity for us. Space, the opportunity of space. And then finally, counterterrorism. There is so much for us to work together on while we work through our economic issues. And as Takahara-san said, and I believe this very strongly, where we can both compete and cooperate, one of the best ways to do that, as a diplomat would say, is find areas of common interest first, come to agreement on those, and then extend that capacity to agree to those areas where competition could become negative. But I think the Biden administration is seeking to find a position in that regard. I'm sorry to go on so long.
Thank you, General Allen. We might sort of discuss later where these thorny issues like the human rights and issues related to sovereignty can hinder the cooperative side of things. But before going into that, I'd like to ask the two Chinese panelists about your sort of perception about the difference between the Biden and the Trumpian foreign policy, or the continuation. Professor Jia has addressed that issue in his remarks. But if you have anything further to add, I'll appreciate it.
Well, I think the Biden administration certainly will do things much better, much different, and also much better in the sense that, as I mentioned in my remarks, that will focus on how to outperform each other rather than undermine each other. I think it would be a good thing for China and the United States to compete, to outperform each other. For example, both countries face the problem of inequality or polarization at home. If we can try to deal with this problem, respectively, and to see who can do better, that will put pressure on the other side to do better. That's good for both countries. Okay. And also on the question of environment, the two countries should compete to do better. If they can do that, then it benefits both countries and also the world. So I don't see competition as a negative thing. I think competition can have very positive results. But I agree with John Allen and also John Hamre that we need to control and manage our conflicts wisely. I think we should not let the old practice of undermining each other to continue. We should not, try to smear each other. We should not demonize each other. We should try to see the best of each other rather than see the worst of each other. And that's the basis for China and the US to get along. There are conflicts, there are differences. They should be managed rather than used as excuse for confrontation and conflicts. I think for that to happen, we need to develop various kinds of dialogues and consultation, and our officials should be constantly talking to each other so that we don't misunderstand and take actions, unnecessary actions for confrontation. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor, for that remarks. Looking at things from Japan, of course, it's important to sort of strengthen the cooperative side of things. But it seems like this doubt and suspicion about the other's motives are increasing on both sides. So the managing of this negative spiral seems to be essentially important. But Professor Takahara, how does things appear from Japan? Which does Japan feel comfortable, the Trumpian China policy or Biden China policy? I'm sure you know this sentiment that Trump China policy, like I said, is rough, tough, and it may even be difficult for Japan to adapt, but because of its ambiguous nature and the clear message that it sent, and as a result of that, there's a sense in Japan that Trumpian China policy might be better. I wouldn't say that's a dominating issue, but there are people who think that way. So how do you see that how do you evaluate that? How do you see the Biden China policy in the context of Japan-China relations?
As you said, there is a variety of views in Japan. As you said, there are people who supported Trump's China policies, and I would say that reflects the big growing concern that a lot of the Japanese have about China's military advancement and sending of Coast Guard vessels into the Senkaku territorial seas. So that pressure action taken by the Chinese is mounting. That's the real fact. And that fact is making a lot of the Japanese genuinely concerned about the future. But at the same time, as I mentioned, there is a lot of cooperation going on. So, it's a very contradictory picture. That's the basis on which we have to wisely devise good measures to deal with China. So there are a lot of other kinds of people in Japan who suffered greatly from the Trumpian sanctions on China, especially in the high-tech field, which were very unpredictable. And from the viewpoint of the business circles, very difficult to deal with. So, we're having both difficulties. It's difficult to deal with a rising China. It was difficult to deal with an unpredictable China policy that came out from Washington. So it's not only Japan, is it? But a lot of the countries were experiencing the same difficulties that we had on both directions.
Well, thank you. By the way, I do fully agree with Professor Takahara, and that if U.S. and China was in a sort of an acute short competition, maybe the Trumpian China policy might have made sense. But U.S.-China strategic competition is a long game. It's going to continue beyond 2030s and 40s and 50s. And in order for U.S. to prepare for that, I don't think the Trumpian China policy made sense. In order for U.S. to prepare to engage in these long competition, I think there's a positive potential for the route that the Biden administration is trying to sort of go forward. Now, there's a whole bunch of questions, but before going into that, I'd like to sort of discuss a little bit about this, the sort of the human rights and democracy side of things between U.S. and China. Biden foreign policy team seems to be very keen on addressing these points, pushing back sort of the authoritarian regimes seems to be one of the main themes of the Biden foreign policy. But at the same time, there are many domestic constraints. There's COVID-19, and there's a reluctance within the U.S. about America playing a major role. I think foreign policy that makes sense to the middle class is another way of saying that. So what does democracy and human rights sort of play into this U.S.-China relations regarding Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Taiwan sort of maybe included in that sphere as well? And what would be China's reaction when U.S. becomes forward-leaning on these issues? Anyone would like to address these points? I understand that it's a sensitive issue, but it's an important issue as well. Dr. Hamre?
Can I chip in on this?
Okay, Professor Wu, you want to jump in first?
Well, the Democrats always has a strong ideological wing, which tends to emphasize on value on human rights in U.S. foreign policy. For China, we started to understand this from the Clinton administration. However, for the current China-U.S. relations, I think the U.S., if the Biden administration wants to play the card of human rights, democracy with China, he has to figure out two issues. One is whether the U.S. has done a good job in protecting its own human rights at home. Just think about the Black Lives Matter, the police abuse of power against the ethnic people, growing in economic inequality, poor handling of the COVID-19. So the U.S. really has a lot of work to do at home to improve its own human rights practice. When it comes to democracy, the real question is, some democracy works well as a governance model, some not. If we look at the US today, I cannot say this model is working very well in delivering good governance, especially under the Trump administration. I mean, for example, the US started from the Obama administration, said it was going to build the high-speed rail. But, two presidents have stepped down. No single inch of high-speed rail has been built in the United States. So is this governance model really working well in the US? So if the US really wants to, show itself to the world, it's a model for protecting human rights and promoting democracy, it should play as an example, rather than to use it as a card in foreign policy toward China or other countries. I think that is the issue between China and the United States on this matter.
I guess someone has to respond from the US. Dr. Hamre.
Well, yeah, first of all, I think Professor Wu is quite right that we need to deal with the very serious problems we have in America. And I think this last year highlighted, some very deep problems that we have. I mean, we still have the unresolved tragedy of slavery, in America, where we brought African Americans here, or Africans to this country in bondage, and then have really not provided the opportunities, that they need to grow and prosper. I think that's right, and he's absolutely right that we didn't handle COVID well. That's absolutely true. America is divided now, and it's a serious issue. But I think there is still a fairly deep consensus and conviction that America is still important because it's a government that observes rule of law, that there are objective rules that we hold presidents accountable to. I mean, just yesterday, the Supreme Court said that Trump couldn't protect his tax records and keep them from a legitimate legal inquiry. So I mean, I think there's a very strong feeling that rule of law is still important for all of us. And I think it's the core, despite all of the divisions in the country, and we do have them, that is still holding us together with a sense of shared commitment to a future. And so I'm not, I don't use the term democracy to slander China. That's not my view. But I do think that things that we have seen in China have caused great concern here. I think the treatment of the Uyghurs, when putting them into, I don't know if you want to call them education camps or concentration camps or work camps, whatever the term is, but that has become a very big issue here in shaping how people look at China. I think the situation in Hong Kong, and of course, Professor Wu would point out we had riots in the United States of people going into legislatures, something that was really bad here too. But I think the situation in Hong Kong has become a pivotal thing in people's perceptions, and where it shows up most dramatically is in the shifting attitude in the United States about Taiwan. This is a very sensitive issue for China. I know that. I've had many conversations with them about it. But what's happened in Hong Kong and what's happened in Xinjiang has caused most Americans to now see Taiwan as something they have to protect by military force. And so I think this is where the perceptions of each other, and like I say, I don't use the slogan democracy to slander China. China has chosen its own form of government, and China has a right to that form. But I think the transcending issues are now starting to have a very direct impact on how we're going to work together on some very sensitive issues. And I think it's something we both should sit back and think through together.
Thank you, Dr. Hamre. A moderator should not making his point, but just briefly, I can't resist. I think the problems that U.S. Or China is facing is clearly a lack of democracy, whereas in the U.S. it's an excess of democracy, and the latter does not sort of delegitimize democracy. It makes us, to make democracy better. So the problems that two countries are facing is fundamentally different. So I just wanted to make that point. Professor Takahara, what is Japan's role in sort of discussing and dealing with these value-oriented sort of issues like human rights and democracy? Japan is not known for being at the forefront of these issues. But clearly, since the Abe administration, there has been a change. So what are Japan's role in addressing these issues?
Well, first of all, we have to make our positions clear on these very important issues: human rights, rule of law. These are foundations of our nation, right? As I quoted the 1947 Constitution of Japan, but the new Japan that emerged as a result of the modernization history since the Meiji Restoration, we have come to the conclusion that these important values are most fundamental for us all. And therefore, when we observe a violation of these important principles that we so much treasure, we will have to raise our voices. I think this is the consensus that exists amongst the majority or all of the people in Japan. But at the same time, are we going to impose sanctions when we see the violations? I suppose that's another question. So therefore, the Japanese are always hesitant about imposing sanctions when these violations take place. As a country that have developed later than the countries in Europe and North America, I think we tend to have this standpoint that we do understand the difficulty that the latecomers face in implementing these values. And these values should not be preached by those countries who have achieved them earlier than others. So we are kind of in that kind of in-between position, and therefore we can easily get criticized from both sides. But here we are, and I think we are on the right spot.
Thank you. Before going into the questions, just one short question from the moderator, which is that what do you see as the most dangerous sort of hot points or misperceptions where U.S.-China relations go sort of, spiral into a negative sphere? Is it Taiwan or trade? How do you see as the most, not in a sort of a long term, but in a short to mid-term? What are the potential hot points and the dangers of misperception between U.S. and China? Maybe each of you could address it shortly. Why don't we do it in reverse order? Professor Wu, you want to start?
Sure. But first, I want to do a very quick response to what you said.
Please go ahead.
About the lack of democracy in China and the too much democracy in the U.S. I think the question here is not democracy enough or not, but whether it delivers good governance. So what is democracy for? Democracy as a means of governance is used to get the country develop and prosper and to make people live well. So yesterday, China just announced it lifted almost 100 million people out of poverty in the last 5 years. That is a tremendous achievement for a developing country like China. So that is the achievement by a governance model of China. So I think this is not that much appreciated in the debate in the West about China. So that's not a matter of democracy or not, but whether this system, this ruling parties, they really deliver to the people. Okay, so that's my response to your question. Response to your remarks. For your question, my real concern is that something could happen between China and U.S. militarily, either in South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait. We had the trade war, we had technology war, and we even had the diplomatic war by closing each other's consulate. But this wouldn't lead to, a conflict between two militaries. However, if something happened between two militaries, in the air or in the sea, under the current political atmosphere, it would be very difficult to manage and de-escalate. So that's my concern.
Thank you. Professor Takahara?
Can I just quickly mention this issue of the relationship between political regimes and the controlling of the COVID? Because I live in Australia now, and Australia, as you know, is a fantastic democracy, and they have controlled the COVID even better than China. So it's not a matter of whether you have a democracy or not. It's not about these fundamental systemic changes, but the measures that you take. And that's the most important thing. And I don't think any democracy, people living in those democracies would like to change this fundamental system. However, in the case of China, we don't know what China will be like in 30 years or even 20 years or from now. So I would support Toshi Nakayama-san's idea that it's a different issue that we are facing in our democracies and in China. But anyhow, about the flashpoints, I would say it's on the maritime front, including Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Jia?
Well, I think there are all kinds of democracies and all kinds of authoritarian systems. Probably it's difficult to just categorize them. Just juxtapose the two systems simply. Some democracies are doing extremely well, like Northern European countries, especially. New Zealand did very well. And others are not doing that well. So it depends. And in terms of authoritarian countries, if you talk about, in the eyes of many in the West, Singapore is an authoritarian country. And it has been doing extremely well as a country, as a governance of responding to people's interests and wishes. But let me return to the question. I think I agree with Wu Xinbo and Takahara-san that the security issue, especially in South China Sea and Taiwan, can be extremely dangerous. Now, I think the two countries need to sit down and talk to each other as to how to manage the security relationship. as long as the two countries regard, some people who are policymakers regard each other as enemy, they're going to push for confrontational policy to not confrontational, but to increase its own defense spending and security at the expense of the other. And then we have this security dilemma. So we have to talk to each other and try to manage and control the possibility of confrontation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Maybe I should have asked, other than the maritime security issues, what are the flashpoints? Because there seems to be a consensus here that, maritime security related issue is the flashpoint. But anyhow, Dr. Hamre?
I think there's a structural issue that really gets to the core of the problem and that is, there were three great questions that we in China had to find answers to. One was, could the United States contain China? And the answer to that, we found out, was no, not at all. It wasn't at all possible. No one in Asia wants to be part of a containment strategy of China. So we learned that. I think the second question was the one that China was asking is, could they push the United States out of Asia? And I think they've come to realize, no, they can't, because other people in Asia want us there. It's just not because we want to be there, they want us there. I think the third question is the real conundrum for us, and that is how we each relate to other countries in Asia. As I said, every other country in Asia wants to have good relations with China, but they're intimidated by China's power. And they want to have the United States there to reassure them of their own independence. But to China, that looks like we are trying to build containment, even though we're simply responding in many ways just to the sovereign needs and desires of these countries. That is the central dilemma that we're having to work through. It's how the two of us view everyone else in Asia. We view them as either partners or allies or potential friends, and China views them as subordinate states that have to be subordinate to China's power in Asia. There's great tension in that. That is the central structural dilemma that I think is the most serious problem we have to work through.
Thank you. General Allen.
I'll agree with John. And I said this once before, a couple things I'll say again. Get ready for this administration to emphasize multilateralism. And we have deep, long-standing, strong relations in East Asia with many of our treaty allies and partners partnerships that can be defined in many ways. That doesn't, as John just said, that doesn't equal a U.S. intent to contain China. It's just the historic manner in which the United States has conducted its foreign relationships and its foreign policy overall. And you'll hear Americans say, the Americans who really understand what's happening in the region, understand China, understand our relationships, that we should never, as Americans, create for our friends and allies in East Asia the requirement that they must choose between the United States and China. Because if we do that, that's a failing policy. And sadly, the last administration alienated many of our friends in East Asia, and having, in many respects, burned the bridges of friendship and trust with those countries, then told them they had to choose between the United States and China. That just, I think, really created tensions in East Asia that were very difficult to manage. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second goes to the issue of the flashpoints that you've mentioned, and it's been said over and over again, but let me just make a couple of points. I said early along, once blood is drawn, it is really hard to walk back from that. And so there are obvious flashpoints. The Taiwan Strait is a matter of issue. I used to own the Taiwan portfolio for the Department of Defense under the Bush administration. I know that very well. And I know that a reasonable American policy, which is still based on a one China policy, is very clear that the United States does not support Taiwan independence, but it does oppose the forcible change of the status quo by either side. And I think we know which side probably would. But that's a reasonable policy. Now, that was taken to a different level with the Trump administration. I think you'll hear reason again in the next administration. But that doesn't mean we won't see tension in the Strait. South China Sea, I really worry about. And I really worry about it because of the presence of the Chinese maritime militia. Chinese Navy, the PLAN, is a very professional organization. But the Chinese maritime militia has come as close as any other entity on the planet to getting into a shooting match with the United States Navy. And I think that once that occurs, now my other concern will kick in, and that is, I'm not sure at a structural level that the United States and China has the capacity, when blood is drawn in a shooting confrontation, to be able quickly enough to manage the escalation or the crisis. And we must go forward in this new opportunity for an relationship environment with the Biden administration to address issues associated with crisis management and structure that can de-escalate a crisis very quickly. And then the final area, no one's addressed this yet, but the final area is the challenge associated with American reconnaissance flights and reconnaissance activity along the Chinese coast and how China reacts to that. And I would remind everyone that while the year 2001 was dominated by the attack on the United States by the terrorists on the 11th of September, the first crisis of the Bush administration in 2001 was the day that a Chinese fighter collided with an American reconnaissance aircraft in the South China Sea. Tragically, the fighter pilot was killed and the American aircraft was forced down on Hainan Island. That brought us perilously close to a real confrontation. And what it pointed out was that we didn't have the structures in place for either country in a real crisis to begin the process of managing the escalation that could have led us in a very negative direction.
Thank you, General Allen. By the way, my good friend, Professor Satoru Mori, is going to chair a session on sort of the military side of U.S.-China competition this afternoon. So whoever is interested in that topic, please stay online and listen to that breakout session. So now I'd like to move on. There's only about 10 minutes. Apologies for my bad moderation. There's several questions related to sort of military technological matters. Maybe that's better addressed in the next session. So I'll try to stay on the sort of political foreign policy side of things. And the one question that I have here is probably addressed to the sort of the American panelists, but I'd like to sort of listen to the sort of Chinese response as well. The question is, how do you see the future of Quad under the Biden administration? Will it evolve into a more institutional structure? Who's ever ready to respond? General Allen, you mentioned that Biden team would be focusing on sort of the multilateral, sort of the alliance network. Would Quad be more sort of emphasized? Would it become more institutionalized? Do you have any perspective on this?
Yeah, I don't know that it'll become institutionalized in the context of a formal agreement in that regard. Many of the participants of the Quad probably have an allergy to wanting to become formally aligned. But I do think there will be continued emphasis on the Quad. We just had a pretty successful meeting of the Quad. So I think under the Biden administration, in consequence of its intent to pursue multilateral engagement that we should see that the Quad will receive special attention.
Dr. Hamre, do you have anything to add?
No, I agree. I agree very much with John Allen, General Allen. The Quad. What brings the Quad together? It's a worry about China. I mean, that's really what brings the Quad together, and but it doesn't share, kind of the underlying integration of geopolitical interests that Europe had, when we created NATO. I mean, that just isn't there, and so I think it really is going to be. The Quad's future is going to be directly related to how much concern people have about China, to be honest.
Thank you. Professor Takahara, although FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, and Quad is not identical, they are related. And FOIP is one of the few sort of grand strategic concepts that Japan has laid out, took an initiative. How do you see Japan's role in sort of making Quad more meaningful? Is Japan forward-leaning on this issue?
Well, first of all, let us make it clear that FOIP has two aspects. One is the strategic aspect, and the other is the economic cooperation aspect of things. And the Japanese vision of FOIP has always been emphasizing the latter, the economic cooperation side. But of course, the free and open maritime order in the two oceans, the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, are of great importance, I think, to all of us, including the Chinese for that matter. But in order to implement that, I think the Japanese side finds the Quad arrangement very valuable. But I'm not sure, as a non-security expert, exactly what kind of measures the Japanese would be proposing, but I think the general direction in which these four important countries are cooperating to see the implementation of a free and open maritime order is found very positive in Tokyo. That's the impression that I have. Thank you.
Thank you. So then what is the perception on the Chinese side? Quad is clearly based on this concern of China's rise. What does a meaningful Quad mean for China?
Can I jump on this?
Please.
Yes. Well, thanks to the declassification of the Indo-Pacific strategy by the Trump administration in the final days of the administration, which states that first and foremost, the purpose of the U.S. Indo-Pacific is to maintain the U.S. primacy in this region. So rhetorically, it says U.S. stands to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. But the real strategic intention is to maintain the U.S. primacy in the face of a rising China. So that also tells that every time when we look at the U.S. strategy, we look at the official rhetoric. What's behind it? What's behind it? So yes, I think Quad is aimed at China. Is that really China is challenging open and free Indo-Pacific? No. I think the concern is that China may challenge the U.S. primacy in this region. That's a real reason in that aspect. Having said that, I don't think that it will have much impact on China. First and foremost, I don't believe China will challenge the open and free Indo-Pacific because China has benefited a lot from an open and free Indo-Pacific. And secondly, China's strategy in this region is more geo-economical than geostrategic. So if Quad is focused more on the geopolitical side to deal with China, you just miss the point. So China just work harder to promote economic cooperation with regional countries. That's fine.
Well, thank you. Professor Jad, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think I agree that whether Quad is going to be enhanced or not will be a function of the perception of the challenge of the rise of China, especially how China-U.S. relationship are going to evolve. If the relationship is evolving in the wrong direction, then Quad would be enhanced, and probably it may be some kind of institutional kind of arrangement will be in place. But if China-U.S. relationship are managed in a more positive way, then I think the Quad would remain a loose security association. So it depends. As far as China is concerned, I think China hopes that to improve relationship with the U.S. Recently, Chinese leaders have issued a few statements trying to send the message that about its intention. However, unfortunately, such kind of messages are interpreted differently in Washington, it seems to me. Basically, they say that China's criticism of the Trump administration as a sort of China's shirking responsibilities for the deterioration of relations between the two countries during the Trump period. I think somehow this kind of message for improvement of relations should be taken more positively. I hope that it will be the two sides can communicate more efficiently in the days to come. That probably would help alleviate some of the anxieties of the Quad countries, and also do not make that institution as a sort of necessary instrument to contain China. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This will be the last question. It's going to be about Japan, but the question is mainly addressed to the U.S. panelists and the Chinese panelists. Not that I'm excluding Professor Takahara. It is about the role U.S. and China expect Japan to play in sort of anchoring or improving or maintaining U.S.-China relations. How does Japan fit in? What is Japan's role? What do you expect from Japan? I'm sure the expectation from the U.S. and expectation from China is quite different. But we'd like to learn from your insights, please. Since we don't have very much time left, if you can answer it in a concise way, I would really appreciate it. Anyone?
Let me volunteer Dr. Hamre.
Dr. Hamre, please.
Well, I would, I can only speak for myself, but I actually think General Allen and I probably share the same views. I think we saw the role we wanted Japan to play, and it did so brilliantly, in my view, at the Osaka G20 summit. Japan demonstrated wisdom that really transcended its own interests and saw the pathway forward for a stable, peaceful evolution and a prosperous evolution in Asia. And it was codified in the G20 summit. It was really superb, and every country there, the United States agreed, China agreed, all the G20. So I would suggest that Japan should return to the G20 summit and help lead the rest of us to realize the strength and the depth of that communique and what it means for all of us in a positive way.
Thank you. Any suggestion from the Chinese side, either Professor Zhao or Professor Wu?
Well, I don't think Japan can play a role in China-U.S. relations as Britain did between U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. However, Japan could have some impact on the extent of cooperation or competition between China and the United States, as we saw in the past. On the maritime issue, I think Japan actually pushed up the level of competition between China and the United States. But maybe on the economic side, thinking about the U.S. trade war against China, I think Japan could help mitigate the tension between China and U.S. And more broadly, I think Japan can play a constructive role in promoting China-U.S. cooperation on global governance issues. So it's up to Japan to decide which way it solves the U.S. solve its own interest. But sometimes this is not a simple question. It depends. It's very much issue-driven, given Japan's national interest.
Well, thank you. We're out of time. I have to apologize to my bad moderation for not being able to address all the good questions. There were many, but many of the questions were more apt for the sessions in the afternoon, which will deal with the military issues. So I recommend these participants to address the question again there. The exchanges, the address were remarkable. I learned a lot. It was my honor to moderate this session. I thank all of you. And hopefully next year we can either see you in Tokyo, DC, or Beijing, or Shanghai, or maybe even Perth, and observe the peaceful Indo-Pacific. Okay, so thank you very much, and please log in again this afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Marines.
Great to see you.
Well.
Bye-bye.